Director of Shadow World Investigations and author Andrew Feinstein. Thanks for joining us today.
Great to be with you.
Thank you. So let's start with the situation about the chemical weapons. As you know, the UN member states signed the Geneva Convention to prohibit the use of chemical weapons and to consider them as a war crimes. However, why does the United Nations remain silent about the chemical weapons used against the Kurds despite the claims and evidences on this issue?
I think that we have to understand that the United Nations as an international body has great difficulty making definitive statements when some of the members of the UN Security Council are potentially involved. So we have seen over many years, we have seen various war crimes, various abuses, the use of chemical weapons, where the UN has refused to say something because the Security Council can't reach agreement. And unfortunately, this seems to be the case at the moment. So, you will find at times a country like the United States will criticize Saddam Hussein for the use of chemical weapons in the Iran-Iraq war, because they were obviously trying to build up a case against Saddam to justify an invasion of Iraq. And the irony of that is that, in fact, America sold Saddam some of the components that made it possible for him to use chemical weapons. So, unfortunately, whenever there is an instance of the use of chemical weapons, which are obviously incredibly serious, the United Nations tends to be a bit useless in actually calling this out. And unfortunately, particularly at the moment, we are living through a period of time globally where various war crimes are being perpetrated against the Kurds, against the population of Yemen, and we are not seeing these war crimes called out in the way that they need to be because the world's largest powers don't have the same view on these issues.
Yeah, that one is actually a bit related with the IPPNW and OPCW as well. So, do you think there can be or should be independent observers sent to the Kurdish region or samples from the region sent elsewhere for analysis to prove that chemical weapons have been used? What kind of process should be followed up about this?
So there are a number of independent bodies in various parts of the world who could play the role of verifying this sort of information very effectively. You mentioned IPPNW, International Physicians for the Prevention of Nuclear War. This is a remarkable organization that is spread through many parts of the world with branches in many parts of the world. I personally have worked with them in Germany, in the United Kingdom, where they're known as MEDACT. And they are remarkable as an organization and as individuals. Many of them are obviously doctors who are committed to stopping war crimes, to seeking peace around the world. And for them to have made the statements they have made about the use of chemical weapons in South Kurdistan and against the Kurdish people means that it's a very, very serious allegation. The problem is, as I said, once the allegation is made, it then gets caught up in geopolitics and usually nothing happens. So I think the idea of an independent body like IPPNW actually advising a body like the United Nations or acting as observers, um, for instance, in the region where these attacks are taking place, would be enormously advantageous. I think it would act as a preventative measure on Turkey, for instance, actually using chemical weapons in this situation, because if there are international observers there, then it's far more likely that those who are using these chemical weapons, those who are committing the war crimes, will actually be made to account for their criminal action. So I think that would be a very important way of addressing what is an incredibly dangerous and unacceptable situation.
Thank you. In front of the whole world, the Turkish state both carry chemical weapons to the ISIS gangs in Rojava and use these weapons their attempt to invade northern Syria as well. What action can be taken against the Turkish state in the international arena?
Again, I'm sorry to sound a little bit skeptical or cynical, but I think that action that is taken in the international arena tends to be hamstrung by the different interests of the world's most powerful countries. So as I mentioned earlier, the United States will criticize one regime for the use of chemical weapons and will then ignore another regime. So the other place where chemical weapons are quite regularly used are the occupied Palestinian territories by the Israelis. And of course, the United States and other Western governments are not going to call out those war crimes. So I think that what we need to do is we still need to try and build coalitions of countries who will speak out about Turkey's actions. But I think perhaps as important in parallel is we need citizens of the world in every country of the world demanding that their governments protest against the actions and impose diplomatic measures against Turkey for their use of chemical weapons against the Kurdish people. And I think it's only campaigns like this that are both aimed at a government level, but also that are driven by ordinary citizens are the most important. I also think, just very quickly, that Turkey has been seen over a number of years now to violate a whole range of international agreements. It, of course, is a member of the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. But this is not new for Turkey to be a member of an international body and then to violate the very agreements that govern that international body. And the time has now come for these international bodies, for the international community to start calling out Turkey to take diplomatic action against Turkey when it violates international agreements, when it commits war crimes. And the only way that's going to happen is if more and more of the world's citizens stand up to say, this is not acceptable. Our governments and we personally must take action against the Turkish crimes.
Yeah, as you mentioned, the diplomatic level of it as well. I just to underline it, I want to ask that as well to you, because you come at a very good point. So I should ask that as well. So the international forces entered to Iraq, as you remember, in 2003, under the pretext of chemical weapons. Everybody remembers that. Why don't the same international powers even take a step against the Turkish state's use of chemical weapons today? Is there anything about economic relations, or is there another policies behind the doors, or is it something to do with the arms deal? Maybe. How would you evaluate that?
I think it's a combination of most of those things. I think, yes, first of all, Turkey has become a very important economic and trading partner for many of the very countries who took action in the early 2000s, but things have changed since then. That's the first thing. The second thing is, I think that many of these countries now actually sell weapons to Turkey. Turkey has become a bigger and bigger market for Western weapons in particular. And I think that, when you're talking about weapon sales worth billions of dollars, countries tend then to be very quiet about any sort of diplomatic protest or any sort of diplomatic objections when the country concerned is a very important client for them. And then the final thing is obviously geopolitics, which is countries trying to bring Turkey closer to them with a combination of carrots or incentives and sticks or punishment. And it depends what is happening in that particular time in the world. And, you know, to be quite frank with you, I think that the world would be a more dangerous place without the international organizations we have and without international diplomacy. But at the same time, acknowledging that, we must also accept how incredibly weak these international institutions are. And we must also be aware of how incredibly weak international diplomacy is, because unfortunately, there is very little integrity, there is very little principle, there are very little positive ethics in international diplomacy today, when we have countries like America, the United Kingdom, and others who are allowing weapons to flow into the Yemen conflict because it's making them billions of dollars, while Yemeni civilians are being killed and intentionally targeted. So similarly, the struggle for the Kurdish people is how to find a way to garner influence and to exert pressure on Turkey at a time when international diplomacy is at such a tawdry level or such a low level ethically.
Thank you. We have only 3 minutes left, but I need to ask you that one as well, because as I know, and the conversation we had earlier before the interview, you are also experienced with the forms of the chemical weapons, as there is three different forms: the gas form of it, the explosives, and also the atomic bombs as well. They are in the category of chemical weapons. So as you have seen as well, Kurdish fighters shared images of Turkish written ammonium nitrate containing bombs and their shells as well, and photos showing wounds on the bodies of various fighters and some dead bodies as well. Isn't the use of ammonium nitrate illegal? Isn't it a war crime? Because we have spoken to someone from Dr. Iskenius, actually from IPPNW, and he was saying that it's a war crime. So we are trying to gather as much as knowledge about this ammonium nitrate. What would you like to say about this?
I think the first thing to say is, if you have somebody from IPPNW who is identifying the substance and is declaring it an illegal chemical weapon, then indeed they are correct in identifying that as a war crime. Chemical weapons, as you correctly say, come in various forms. They are one of the worst forms of weapon that we have in the world today. And that is why we have had conventions against the use of chemical weapons. We have the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, because they are so dangerous in the way that they impact on the people they affect. And ammonium nitrate, along with white phosphorus, for instance, would be amongst the worst of these chemical weapons. And the sorts of wounds that you're talking about, the sorts of burning that you're talking about, is something that would be fairly common to ammonium nitrate. So the chances are pretty good that it is that sort of substance. There is no doubt in my mind that chemical weapons are being used. I think it is extremely unlikely that Kurdish fighters would be able to find these castings and these shells from somewhere and make up some sort of a pretense about the use of these weapons. So I think that the chances that it is a chemical weapon is very likely. I think that we must be absolutely clear about the dangers here for the Kurdish people, not just Kurdish guerrillas, but the Kurdish people generally, but for all the people of the world. Because if we allow the use of chemical weapons by Turkey or any other entity, we are giving license to other groups, both state groups and non-state groups, to use these weapons more and more. And the consequence of that is going to be an intensification of human suffering of an order we haven't seen for quite a long time in the world. So I think that we have a responsibility as citizens of the world, first and foremost, to ensure that any example, any evidence of chemical weapons is properly investigated, and those using them are brought to account as a matter of urgency, because the alternative is too awful to bear for all of us.
About the this green smoke that has been recorded by the Kurdish fighters of the mountains in the caves that been used to kill Kurdish fighters. I want you to put down your own comment about this chemical, what it can be, what kind of form is it.
From my experience of 20 years of working on weapons generally, it's clear to me that there are a number of types of chemical weapons, of poisons, of agents that are used. Probably the most famous is what we call white phosphorus, which is a sulfuric type of acid that is used in the occupied Palestinian territories by Israel, for instance. A green smoke could be a number of things. There are certain types of nitrates that it could be, but there is also the possibility that you can add two chemical agents. You can actually add coloring to them to try and disguise them. So it's not always entirely clear what the poison gas or chemical weapon that is being used is. But there is a possibility, obviously, that it is ammonium nitrate, but it could also be something else that is being disguised, if you will, with some sort of a green covering. So I think, again, this brings us back to an earlier comment that you made. I think what would be the best way forward on this issue would be if an independent, neutral body like IPPNW could have the opportunity to access all of the evidence of the chemical weapons that have been used against Kurdish guerrillas, and if they could make a public statement about what they come up with after testing these various weapons, so that the world will know exactly what is being used. And then, of course, appropriate action needs to be taken against Turkey and anybody else who is using these weapons.
Director of Shadow World Investigations and author Erem Feinstein, thanks for joining us. Thank you for your valuable comments today.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you.